Okay, so now I'm going to provide some hints on how this might work. So the idea here is we want to associate an instance of a dependency to we want to associate the instance dependency to a computation. So the catch here is this update function that we're taking in here, in fact, can be stored somewhere as well. It's a variable, right? Functions are variables. So what we can do is let's have something like a global variable called active update, right? Because in JavaScript is single-threaded. At any given time, only one function can be currently executing, right? So if we create a function that marks itself as the function that's currently being executed, then we can know any time whether this function is currently running. Now we know if we're inside this function. Does that make sense? So if, let's say we have this function called wrapped update, and inside wrapped update, we call the original update, okay? So this is equivalent. What we want to know is, what we want to do is, when we want to know whether we are inside this inner update function. And the way we can do that is do active update equals wrapped update. So let's think about what we have achieved here. Whenever we call wrapped update, and the code inside this update function executes, any functions or any code being called or executed inside this update function, they're guaranteed to be able to access this outer wrapped update function via the active update global variable. So if we do this, and let's say auto run a function, oops. So now we can check active update here, right? This active update will always be pointing to the wrapped update that's created for this one. Does that make sense? So this is the current. This variable will always point to something that references this. But what's more important is when we call dep.depend here, right? Even inside the dep class, we can check the active update as well. So inside the deps implementation, remember we're calling dep.depend inside the autorun, and we're essentially calling it inside here. And because we're calling here, this active update would have been set to this. So if active update, we need to register the current active update as a subscriber. And what the notify function does is run all subscriber functions. What this means is this dep class probably needs an instance property to store its subscribers, right? Let's create a constructor. So we can use an array, but array requires some deduping. So we'll use the ES6 set, which is easier. Okay. So essentially, what you need to do is fill in the rest. I'll make it smaller so you can see. So let's take another 5-minute break, working break.
It's 5 minutes, we can just keep it going. First, processing. Oh, awesome. So just working. Oh, it is. Yeah. Both videos. Here, coffee.
Okay, so
Fine during breaks.
something I forgot here
The door.
is you need to call this wrapped update immediately. So that would essentially perform the initial round of dependency collection.
I still have to come back.
Leave that.
It sucks because local startup with those 42 is a great solution. Really very cool and like great tables of data. But it's all that yeah, but okay, we still have one point of failure. That's it. No other backup.
Syntax error somewhere. Gosh. Let me sage it. Sure. So it's expected comma, I think.
You don't want your functions to be comma separated in the class.
Where you going?
Object. Declaration. Thank you. My linting is turned off because he has
Yeah, we got started a little late.
serious like memory leaks. So I'm just kind of used to seeing the red squiggle and ignoring them.
Yeah. I thought about this like that too. It was like, oh, someone wrote nothing like our linting syntax.
Primarily working in memory these days.
If you go late, you have to 4:30, which is like, see, like,
So all of your functions are separately.
And then we'll just go until you're done.
It's totally appropriate behavior.
For this, around 4:30.
Well, I gotta make some explanation. So it's gonna all that happen.
Yeah, it's just a matter of like, not everybody will be able to see it, but family or whatever, right? So probably half will be cut off around 4:30.
Okay, so we're gonna try to walk through the solution a little bit. So if you've followed up until here, we kind of understand that all of this does is making sure that when this inner update function executes, our dependency class can actually have access to the current active update. That's the whole point, right? So now that we have a grab of the current updater function that's being executed, we will register that update function as a subscriber to this dependency. So we'll just add that active update into our subscriber list, right? So as you can see, the thing is, okay, we'll talk about that later, but inside Notify, this is actually pretty straightforward. ES6set also has the for each function, so we can just take the subscriber function and just invoke it. That's pretty much it. So this is actually the whole implementation, right? So one thing to note here is why are we using this wrapped update, right? We're registering the wrapped update as the active update so that when our dependency changes and the update function is called again, we're in fact calling this again so that this little dependency tracking trick is still working on future iterations. So it keeps collecting dependencies. So this is important because in some cases, our update function might contain conditionals. So one variable is true, it might collect this dependency, and when the variable is flipped, it might collect another dependency. So in fact, our dependency collecting system needs to be dynamically rebalancing these dependencies to make sure the dependency list is always up to date. So our implementation, although working for our test case, in fact misses some edge cases. For example, when you call we need to clean up stale dependencies. So if the execution no longer depends on a certain dependency, we need to actually clean it up. This is not accounted for in this simple implementation. And then there's the question of how to deal with arrays, right? And the question of how to deal with newly added properties. So these are much more complex questions. And if you're interested, you should probably read the source code of Vue to figure that out. But due to the time here, we're going to move on with this simple version of it. So let's go into exercise 3. Now is the time to put the previous two exercises together, okay? And it's actually going to be simpler than you think. So let's combine the previous two functions. So currently we have convert function from exercise 1. We have the auto run function from exercise 2. So let's rename convert into observe, all right? So what observe does is just take any object, observe it, converting them into getters and setters. And inside getters and setters, we can do something with dependencies, right? And then the auto run just remains the same from the previous exercise. So we're reusing the depth class and auto run function from exercise 2. And then what we need to do is copy over convert from exercise 1 and modify it so that we hook up the dep.depend and dep.notify calls into the getters and setters. Then when these connect, we essentially have created an object. When we access a property, it collects dependencies by calling dep.depend. And when we mutate the property by assigning to it, it calls dep.notify to trigger changes. Are the dots connecting now? So this is actually how the view update system works. Okay? So this is what we want. Let's say we just have a state object with count 0. The finished implementation should observe the state. This will walk through the properties, convert them into getters and setters. And the auto run, inside auto run, we're still doing just a console log. But the thing, notice here, we're accessing state.count. This is just a normal access. But if we have converted the object into getters and setters, this will be invoking the getter here, right? And this is the opportunity where we should call dep.depend. And later on, when you mutate the state.count, we are invoking the setter. And this is where we should call dep.notify. Okay? So exercise 3 is just to fill in the blanks. So notice you can reuse most of the code from exercise 1 and 2. And it should be pretty straightforward up to this point. Okay, let's give it another 10 minutes.